as we recognize Domestic Violence Awareness Month, we'll be taking a close and careful look at this issue, considering what a just response should entail and how we can all make our homes and communities safer. Today is the 6th event in Justice Revival's ongoing series, The Heart of Human Rights. I'm Allison McKinney-Tim, founder and executive director of Justice Revival, a Christian voice for human rights in the United States, and I'll be your host for today's important conversation. We are so glad that you came. We'd like to invite everyone who's watching to introduce yourselves, if you wish, in the chat box. You can also use the Q&A function to pose any questions that you have of our guest speakers, and we'll be taking questions from the audience later on in the hour. Please also check the chat box for important hotline information in case you or someone you know is facing an immediate threat of sexual or domestic violence. And we have a fabulous, diverse panel of esteemed expert guests, all of whom bring a great depth of expertise in responding to violence against women through a range of different subject matter approaches to the issue. Let me introduce each of them just briefly and kind of highlight their amazing bios, which I encourage you to check out on our website as well. Dr. Indira M. Hennard, Executive Director of the DC Rape Crisis Center, has been involved in the violence against women movement for 20 years. She earned her Master's of Social Work degree from Catholic University of America. Dr. Hennard was recently awarded the National Victim Impact Award from the Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences. Professor Francisco Rivera Juaristi teaches law at the Santa Clara University School of Law, where he is founding director of the International Human Rights Clinic. He co-authored the 2020 report, Safer Sooner, which identifies gaps in the international legal system and maps a path toward a new global norm on ending violence against women. The Reverend Dr. Marie Fortune is founder of Faith Trust Institute, a national multi-faith, multicultural training and education group working to end sexual and domestic violence. She is a pastor, author, educator, and practicing ethicist and theologian, ordained in the United Church of Christ, and her influential books include Sexual Violence, The Sin Revisited. And finally, Deborah Rosenblum, JD MPA, is Chief Program Officer for Jewish Women International, where she leads social justice initiatives engaging Jewish, interfaith, and secular communities in addressing gender-based violence through advocacy, training, resource development, and community building. And thanks again for joining us today for this important conversation. I'd like to start by asking each of our panelists just to give us a sense of what tools you use in your profession, in your current role, in order to analyze and respond to the problem of violence against women. And I'll just maybe go in the order that I did with introductions. And Indira, if I could begin with you, kind of how do you as a social work professional approach this topic in general?
Yeah, thank you so much, Allison. And it's great to be with you all and my esteemed colleagues on this panel. I think for me, as a trained social worker and advocate and mental health professional, you know, the first thing we're taught in social work school is the person in environment, right? And so one of the first things I do is really look at things from the intersections, right? What we know to be true is that all forms of oppression are connected. And so when someone is coming with sexual trauma, what we also know is that they're coming with other things as well, whether it's food insecurity issues or housing issues. I think the other piece is just humanity, right? We know that sexual violence shows up in many different ways, and we know what the trauma responses can be as a result of that. And so coupled with looking at just the person and environment, as well as just looking at sexual violence from an intersectional, anti-oppressive, anti-racist lens, also just using that compassion and humanity, just in terms of when folks are engaging and just how we are supporting them, not just on the short term, but also on the long term as well.
Marie, how do you, as an ethicist and theologian, come to this issue?
Well, Ellie, I began working in this in 1977 after I finished seminary. And my concern at that time was I wanted to do ministry with women. And what I began to realize is how common violence against women is and how it stretches across all of our differences as women. So as a common concern, it seemed to me like a place that we needed to give some attention. But specifically for me as a minister, that looking at my own faith community and realizing there was nothing. There was literally nothing, no conversation, no research, no activity that I could find. And so I think what I've tried to bring to this and through Faith Trust Institute is an educational approach that basically says we need to talk about this, we need to learn about it, we need to train our leadership to be not only responsive in a pastoral sense, but also to be speaking out in terms of public leadership and beginning to change the cultural norms that have allowed violence against women to thrive for centuries. And as far as I'm concerned, the church is part of the problem, and we have to be part of the solution.
We're gonna dive into that and talk more about that. Francisco, tell us about your approach as a professor of human rights law.
Yes, thank you, Allison. So yes, my area of expertise is international human rights law. So my day job, as you mentioned, is to run a law school program at a Jesuit law school here in California at Santa Clara University. And what we do is we have students work in real cases and projects involving human rights issues. Now, we advocate locally and internationally on issues involving violence against women. In fact, later today, we will be participating in a meeting with local government officials to see if we can get a law passed to do gender audits within the county of Santa Clara. And since 2015, with the clinic, we've been involved with this great organization called Every Woman Treaty. It's a diverse coalition. We have thousands of activists, of academics, survivors, hundreds of organizations throughout the world trying to, promote a new global treaty to address violence against women. So I've been involved in that in various capacities, and now I'm part of the board of directors. But as you mentioned in the introduction, we authored a report called Safer Sooner. And in that report, we really identified several gaps under international human rights law, right, to address and prevent violence against women. And we did research over a number of years and asked thousands of leaders and organizations from all over the world, what's a way forward, right? And all of these experts, organizations, community leaders, we all came to the consensus that we want to support a new form of global norm on international human rights law to address violence against women. And right now we're in the midst of a years-long diplomatic campaign to sort of move the negotiations of this treaty forward within the context of the United Nations. I'd be happy to talk more about that later.
Thank you. And Deborah, tell us about your approach at JWI.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. At JWI, our organization is 125 years old, and about 40 years ago, one of our members was murdered by her husband. And it was a shock in the Jewish community. And it was a shock for many reasons. They were an affluent couple, highly educated couple, both scientists, both working in federal scientific circles. And the Jewish community was sort of taken by surprise because there had been this myth that this doesn't happen to people like that. And so we wanted to break that silence, and we started doing a lot of public awareness and working in community. And our approach is really in community. So what does our faith, my specific faith community, bring to this? How can we ensure that we can change the culture within our faith community, which is a patriarchal community to many extents? And how can we ensure that this doesn't happen to more people? So we work at the community level to create that kind of cultural change. We work on federal level advocacy to create that kind of systemic change. And we work on prevention, because one of my biggest concerns was, how are we going to prevent this from happening? So we do a lot of healthy relationship work with teens and young adults on college campuses. And since then we've expanded. So we now do work, interfaith work, and a lot of secular work. Interestingly, when we began the work, about 20 years later, when I came on, I've been there since 2004. We were not really welcome. Faith wasn't really welcome at the national discussions and conversations around violence against women, because faith was seen as a barrier, right? So you got married under God, and that was your marriage, and go live with that, and that was a holy sacrament, or it was holy in some way. And so what we wanted to do was to be able to change that narrative, and to ensure that people understood that marriage that way wasn't a holy sacrament, wasn't religiously condoned, and that people were able to leave that. We only could do that through training with rabbis and clergy. So we took that on as well. And I think that all these pieces helped convince the national circles that we were eligible to be at the table, that we were a welcome partner, because we saw faith as opposed to being a barrier, to be able to change that conversation and saying faith can be a resource to the most vulnerable if it's used well.
It's interesting to notice the parallel between your work and Marie's at Faith Trust, and the way that I hear you both saying that religious power has been in the past complicit or part of preventing solutions, but that it can play a positive role, which is important, good news for us all. So you've started talking to some of the root causes of this sweeping, widespread problem of violence against women already, and I'd like to invite everyone to speak to this a little further. We're talking about the most ubiquitous human rights abuse in the world. Why is that the case? Why do we see such high prevalence levels? I mean, certainly this must be a complex problem and multi-layered, to be sure, but could you speak to what maybe a few of the most important root causes are that you're addressing? And Indira, maybe you could start us off with that question.
Yeah, I mean, I think, what we know about sexual violence is that it's not about sex, right? It's about power, it's about control. We see the ways in which rape culture is continuing to be perpetuated in society, in the ways in which gender-based violence is talked about, is dealt with in various communities and across disciplines. And I think what we also have to do is begin to have an intergenerational conversation around sexual violence. Language is so important when talking about sexual violence, and everyone is operating from what I call a different dictionary. And so really looking at how gender-based violence sits on a spectrum. It's not within this narrow definition that folks used to think about, but that it's wide. And that's important because the way that it is talked about also influences the way that it is dealt with, which also contributes to how we are continuing to see rape culture perpetuated throughout society.
Francisco, could you talk to the same question of root causes and also the issue of language that Indira brought up? what's the significance of us even framing this today as a program on violence against women? What's the significance of speaking of this as a human rights abuse?
Right. So I think it's really important to frame violence against women as its own human rights violation. I think it's really important. And maybe just a step back, we talk about violence against women, but we don't really define it sometimes. So from my perspective as an international human rights lawyer, I look at the international treaties that provide a definition for that, and we can look at, for example, the Istanbul Convention, which is an international treaty that defines violence against women as, first of all, a violation of human rights in and of itself, right? But it's also a form of discrimination against women. And it includes all acts of gender-based violence, right? That are result in or are likely to result in physical, sexual, psychological, or also economic harm, which is not always included, right, in that definition. Economic harm or suffering to women, and that includes threats of such acts, coercion or arbitrary deprivation of liberty. And it's important to focus at it. That can happen both in the public or in the private life. I think one of the other panelists was talking about, in when you get religion involved, sometimes then you forget that the state also has a role to play, in addressing violence against women, even in the domestic sphere and even in the private sphere of religion. So I think it's really important, to address violence against women as its own human rights violation, because otherwise you sort of compartmentalize it into its different components. So violence against women, we know, affects women in different other human rights. So it could be a violation of the human right to life if they get killed, right? Or the human right, to equal protection under the law if they're not protected adequately, or the human right, to equality within the family, or to favorable conditions of work. So these are all really important components to understand violence against women. But understanding violence against women as a standalone human rights violation helps us better address it, right? It provides women with better access to justice. It prevents diluting this, as you mentioned, this grave form of violence against women or human rights violation into just generic categories of human rights violations that are not very precise, right? So I do think the trend in international law and also in domestic law is to treat violence against women as its own thing, right? Rather than as a combination of multiple human rights violations. And that really gives us a good tool to address it, and powers also matter. Calling it a human rights violation matters. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, as you're talking about equality and the right to life, it strikes me, my sense is that in the United States, people are much less familiar with the right to life broadly as it is expounded under international human rights law. We're used to hearing that in such a limited particular claim. And also the idea of gender equality being fundamental to addressing this abuse is something that I hear in your explanation of the law. And maybe we can talk more about that. Marie, yeah.
I totally agree with Francisco in terms of placing the discussion under the rubric of violence against women, because part of what that allows us to do is to really look critically at context. And the reality of patriarchy is, again, the common framework in which all of this is taking place. So whether it's economic or political or religious or what have you, we're all operating still within that context, which is why women are targeted, and women are viewed as more vulnerable, and women, trans women, anyone who's perceived as vulnerable within a patriarchal context, and in a context in which male privilege and entitlement has functioned for centuries. So I think we have to start there. And then we can deal with the particular pieces, whether it's physical, sexual abuse, sexual harassment, and always recognizing that women are not the only persons victimized, that men and boys, certainly, and non-binary people are also victimized, but it's in a different context in terms of a social analysis of what's going on.
Deborah, I wonder if you could speak initially for us to what's happened during this pandemic of COVID that lived through the last 2 to 3 years, and how have you seen that affect rates and intensity and survivors or victims' ability to seek help if faced with violence?
Yeah, I mean, domestic violence has actually been named as the shadow pandemic during COVID because there's so much more opportunity for domestic violence and so much more of it happened. During lockdown, people were home with their abusers with no way out. People weren't getting out to their safety networks. They weren't going to work. They didn't have those places of safety where they could, leave the house. And we actually formed a peer support forum during COVID for advocates working specifically with Jewish survivors to be able to help them process all the harm that they were going through, working with survivors during this incredibly difficult time, because the survivors were coming to them saying that my abuser's home, I can't get out. And here's what's happening to me. And they still wanted to be able to connect with the advocate. And how do you do that in that kind of situation? People thought initially that because people were home, there wouldn't be as much opportunity in public spaces for sexual crimes and domestic violence, but that wasn't true because some women were still leaving the house to go to their jobs, which were around healthcare or around the services that were considered essential, and people were able to get out to those. And so, but in those places, there were fewer bystanders, there were fewer people to see what was going on and to address it that way. So you had people at home, you had people socially isolated, you had all the exacerbations of the pandemic in terms of unemployment, in terms of children being home all the times, in terms of not being able to get out, in terms of loss of the safety networks, in terms of all the frustration and depression around COVID and what it meant, and so many more opportunities for abusers to take advantage of that. So it's skyrocketed all over the world. The numbers skyrocketed. I've seen different numbers. I'm not big on statistics. I've seen many numbers, but I know that it was big enough. It has been big enough that it's been called the shadow pandemic, and something that has been addressed more seriously. And actually, for our work, it helped our work speak to the public. We were able to do much more around public awareness because suddenly people understood it. Suddenly, when people were home who were normally not listening to our messages around the prevalence of domestic violence or its presence in people's homes and lives and relationships, said, now I get it. Like, I get it in a different way, because even if they were in a healthy relationship, they were still home with their partner. And they understood what that strain would look like and what could happen. And they could visualize what might happen if they felt physically, sexually, or emotionally in danger. So it flipped. It actually brought the issue out, I think, more to the public. There was much more public awareness around domestic violence.
So an increase in prevalence and maybe intensity, but also awareness and consciousness.
Yeah.
And Tara, what have you seen during COVID at the DC Rape Crisis Center?
Yeah, I mean, I can say, this is our 50th year in service, our 50th anniversary, and I've been at the center almost 15 years, and this is the first year within the last 2 to 3 years under COVID that I have seen our services at the level that they are. We were able to pivot quickly at the start of the pandemic, but what we have had to do and continue to do is really do a survey of where our clients are, right? Moment by moment, in terms of, for example, when we first pivoted our services to telehealth, we had to do training on technology, right? We had to make sure that we bridged the intergenerational divide in terms of making sure clients knew how to access virtual services, making sure they had equipment to do so, to include Wi-Fi, right? Because Wi-Fi is a privilege. Everybody doesn't have Wi-Fi. And so really thinking about those intersectional issues. We know, as mentioned just now, home was not safe. And so really looking at the needs from an intersectional level, we got a high request for kind of food support and housing support, because some folks got laid off, some folks lost their jobs. And so I think the other piece that we saw is the impact not just on the survivor, but the family as a whole, right? So particularly with our youth, what we saw is they were at home during, having virtual school. That was a lot. And so what we saw is families trying to cope with that, families trying to cope with how that was impacting their child's trauma. And in dealing with that, that also kicked up the parents' trauma. Right. And so again, this impact really was intergenerational on the individual, community, and family. And so we are seeing a high number of requests for emergency crisis sessions because clients are showing up, their nervous system is dysregulated, and it's dysregulated because of what's happening in the world, right? We are still in the midst of a pandemic, as quiet as it's kept. Also, at the racial reckoning is still happening, the political trauma, and I'm very intentional around political trauma that is happening, understanding the catastrophic consequences that can have on survivors. So we are seeing the impact layered as well as intersectional, and we are preparing for kind of the unintended consequences and the long-term effects that perhaps will be coming down the pike.
Wow. So much fallout during the time of COVID and these overlapping crises, including the epidemic of violence against women. And another new development just this summer at the US Supreme Court with the Dobbs ruling that overturned Roe versus Wade and the constitutional right to an abortion in this country. The research tells us that on average, right now, 4 women are murdered a day by their partners in the United States. And studies have found that the risk of homicide can as much as double during pregnancy and the postpartum period. Deborah, let me ask you, what impact, if any, have you seen or do you anticipate on the problem of violence against women?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. So reproductive coercion is a dynamic of domestic violence. And that means that the partner doesn't let the woman use birth control or refuses to use it himself. And what that does is force it. So there might be rape and there might be refusal to use birth control. And there might be an inability then to be able to access abortion. And so reproductive coercion is a dynamic of domestic violence. And what Dobbs is doing is saying that people who have been made pregnant against their will don't have access to that abortion. And they are put in more danger because, as you said, being pregnant is one of the most challenging, one of the most dangerous times for a woman to be in an abusive relationship. And yet she can't get out of it. So there's a huge impact. The nexus between reproductive coercion and the lack of access to abortion is going to play out for years and years. And I saw statistics yesterday, something like 320,000 women a year are abused during their pregnancy. It's a huge number, and that has many risk factors for the fetus itself, and might necessitate ending that pregnancy at that point, or she might just not have wanted the baby to begin with and wanted to be able to terminate the pregnancy and doesn't have access to that.
Indira, do you want to comment on the same issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're seeing is that the Roe v. Wade is just having such a hard impact on survivors of sexual assault. What we know is that 32,000 women a year get pregnant as a result of rape. And so abortion health care has to be an option for survivors. And, we also know that the fallout from Roe v. Wade disproportionately impacts women of color and other folks who identify on the gender spectrum. And so we really have to be intentional around what is coming down the pike and what's at stake. We're starting to see a high increase in survivors requesting information for OBGYNs who are survivor-centered and trauma-informed, and culturally responsive, so that they can find a doctor who can support them in all of their reproductive health needs. And so, the intersection between reproductive justice and sexual violence and domestic violence is quite intertwined.
Hmm. And when we think about how faith communities play or could play a role in responding to the injustice of violence against women, this is a whole sort of complicated, interlocking set of issues. I mean, I can share that for me as founder of Justice Revival, one of the inspiring kind of principles that led me and others to found this organization for human rights is believing that faith does and should lead us to care about the human rights of all people and care about the problems like the ones we're talking about today. I also discovered that in the United States, religion is often cited to oppose human rights. So, Francisco, I want to ask you about this. We know there's a treaty, CEDAW, on women's rights. You're working on other treaty mechanisms, yet we see people of faith. I can say we see Christians on both sides of those important issues. What would you say about that?
Yeah, well, I think it's important for our audience to know that under international human rights law, as you mentioned, we have this existing treaty called CEDAW. It's the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. And it's one of those treaties that pretty much every country in the world has ratified. What that means is that the country has elected to be bound by that treaty. So all countries in the world except 6 have ratified that treaty. And one of those is the United States. And the other countries will be like Somalia, and South Sudan, so really non-functioning governments. So we're really a pariah in international law, we being the United States, right? And part of the reason for that has to do with constitutional law. So just bear with me for a second, right? So under the US Constitution, the US Senate is the only body in charge of being able to ratify these international treaties. So it's a really selected, so it's not the executive branch, it's not the judicial branch, it's the legislative branch, and particularly the Senate. And in order for the US to ratify this treaty, you need 60 votes. So it's a vast majority, right? And historically, there's one party in power, that has opposed, ratifying even this treaty on discrimination against women. And the reasons that are given forward for that are often religious reasons, right? It's often issues of reproductive health care. It's often issues of abortion, but also issues of the role of the church and government in providing sexual education to women and girls in school or not, right? So we do see this sort of, conflict, as you mentioned, Allison, where you have faith communities who overwhelmingly support, national and international law that supports, women to be protected from violence, right? But at the same time, you have faith groups that pose obstacles, huge obstacles, that put pressure on the political organs that are in charge of, providing these great laws, that we have in place, to address violence against women. So it's this dichotomy that we keep having, right? And as you mentioned, we at Every Woman Treaty are trying to advocate for a new global treaty to address violence against women. And we're facing those questions that you have posed, how do we actually pitch the idea of a broader encompassing global treaty on violence against women that addresses reproductive health care, for example, and we have conversations with countries that are very conservative in nature and that use religion to justify their opposition to such treaties, right? How do you engage in those conversations, and how do you negotiate, whether to move forward with a treaty that is all encompassing, right? On the one hand, versus a treaty that sort of addresses a lot of the concerns raised by, faith communities throughout the world that have to do with, again, reproductive health rights or others. And I can give an example. In the African Union, we have a great treaty on violence against women, it's the Maputo Protocol. And that treaty actually recognizes the right to an abortion, and it addresses issues of cultural concern like female genital mutilation, forced circumcision, things like that. And it was a lot of opposition by religious groups in different African countries who did not want to include that language in this international treaty. Nevertheless, the treaty included that language, and it's been widely ratified by most countries of the region, which I think suggests, that the concerns by religious communities throughout, the world on issues of reproductive health care as they relate to violence against women are not insurmountable, I think, and are not necessarily incompatible with the basic respect for human rights and the basic respect, of the right to a life free of violence. But it does present some challenges that we have to deal with it every day. Yeah.
So here's this example of a regional human rights treaty in Africa that's taking measures that the US hasn't been willing to take to address violence against women on a systemic, legal, structural basis. Marie, I want to turn to you as we think about where has the church been, given this tension we've been discussing about seeking to assert women's right to live free from violence as a human right, and then finding resistance. I know you've seen this up close. Where has the church been? Where is it now? Are there signs for hope here?
Well, it's been, as I said, part of the problem, and a big part of the problem in terms of shaping the discussion, shaping the laws that we live under, and so forth and so on. But I think that one of the basic principles that we've worked on from an educational perspective is the notion that faith and the teachings and our sacred texts and so forth can function as either a roadblock to responding appropriately to violence against women, or a resource. And we have the choice to make whether our own traditions and the way in which we use them will be a roadblock to women's well-being and to your point of living without fear, or will it be a resource that enables and supports that? And so that's kind of the big question, the big opportunity. The part of the point is that faith communities have to be part of this. That there's no way that you can set this aside as like it's not important. And I appreciate, Deborah, your comment that over the years that our secular colleagues have begun to understand and appreciate that we have to be at the table to have that part of the conversation, or we're never going to get anywhere with this. A lot has changed in my time, and being able to see that has been rewarding, but not nearly enough. It's still, violence against women is not a priority in faith communities. And that's part of I feel like we haven't gotten there yet, because there's so many issues that our faith communities are faced with, no doubt, and they're competing in terms of resources. But the notion that violence against women is such a fundamental fact in women's lives and in our families' lives, and it's not a fundamental part of how our faith communities preach and teach and are active in the community, is a real problem. So there's much more that needs to be done in terms of our scholarship, our training of leadership, our pastoral responses, and so forth, so that it's absolutely clear that faith communities stand with persons who've been victimized by violence and abuse, and also stand to hold those who inflict that victimization accountable. So, and again, that takes us back to the legal end, where how we engage when we have a sex offender in a congregation, how we respond to that, how we work with that person to ensure that they do no harm and so forth and so on. There's just so many points at which faith communities have a remarkable opportunity to make a huge difference in responding to this. But one example I give in thinking about sexual violence in particular, and the reason we're not good at this, in addition to the fact that we don't want to talk about it and we don't want to be in a public conversation about this, is that most of our faith traditions, I'll generalize here for a moment, regard rape as, and as Indira said, a sexual matter. And so the issue ethically is rape as a violation of sexual norms, i.e. adultery. And as long as we have that perspective, we can't get to what's really going on here, which is the violence and the taking advantage of people and exploiting people and so forth and so on. So when, in the initial conversations with faith leaders about, my question always to people is, well, what's really wrong with rape? Why is rape wrong? Tell me, tell me, your perspective on why we think it's wrong. And usually within a Christian setting, people will go immediately to the Ten Commandments and adultery. And the U.S. Catholic bishops, when they finally began to confront the sexual abuse of children within the Catholic Church, and their first public discussion, that's where they went. And people in the pews were going, what does this have to do with adultery? We're talking about abuse of our children. So we've got to find theologically and scripturally a way to frame this so that we really get at what's going on, which is harm to persons. And I much prefer in the Ten Commandments to go to thou shalt not steal, because the theft of a person, the theft of their heart, their soul, their body is fundamental to sexual and domestic violence. And so if we begin to approach it with a different theological lens, I think we have more of an opportunity then to be able to get people willing to look at this and willing to look at it honestly, and perhaps shift the cultural norms away from the notion of sexual harm to something, much more than that.
Yeah. So we're concerned about rape, not from the angle of this being a sexual adulterous transgression per se, but this being an abuse of another human being who's made in the image of God. You mentioned the focus on the nature of the relationship and the marriage as compared to other ethical aspects of the encounter. And that just made me think, I learned this week that the state of Maryland, where I am right now, does not legally prohibit rape within the marriage relationship. So there's that history, and that's the case in a number of states. So there's the patriarchal history influencing our present day reality. I want to get to some of the reforms that we know are needed and need to be enforced. Deborah, will you talk to us a bit about the Violence Against Women Act? What has it meant? Why was it so hard to get it reauthorized by Congress after a 3-year lapse?
So, yes, that's an excellent question. Why was it so hard? So the Violence Against Women Act is it's the big piece of legislation that the federal government has to ensure that states and localities get support and advocates in those states and localities get training, that police are trained, first responders are trained, that advocates have the resources that they need to support their survivors, that there's prevention programming, that there's intervention around rape crisis, that there's all these things that make our world safer, and it's a survivor-centered bill. And it's always been bipartisan. It was introduced initially in 1994 with then Senator Biden. It's just in March passed as part of the omnibus bill. It had been out of authorization since 2018. It's supposed to be reauthorized every 5 years. The sticking points, and we worked closely. We serve on the National Task Force to End Domestic and Sexual Violence. on the steering committee. And so we were working closely with Congress to get this reauthorized. Our particular push on this was around the closing with what we call the boyfriend loophole, which I'll get to in a second. But in 2013, there were some really wonderful pieces were put into the Violence Against Women Act, including non-discrimination clauses against people in the LGBTQI community, that service providers could not discriminate against them, ensuring, recognizing also that tribal sovereignty over people. So if a crime by a non-Indian was committed on a tribal reservation around domestic violence, that the court there had jurisdiction. And that was a big, big deal. And what we were looking for here was no rollbacks. And so we met that. There were no rollbacks with this new Violence Against Women Act. But it's been a very, very tough thing, because what we wanted was we wanted to ensure that more funding would be available for culturally specific services, which essentially serves BIPOC communities and for the underserved communities, which are mostly faith communities and disability communities and also LGBTQI communities, that there'd be more funding there, that there'd be more funding for prevention, and that the boyfriend loophole, which is so in the law as it stands, in 1994 when it was passed, people who had been convicted of domestic violence could not have access to a gun. They didn't have the right to a gun anymore. And that was expanded by the Lautenberg Amendment 2 years later. And since then, what we've been trying to do is get that to be recognized, that in a dating situation, when the couple hasn't lived together and doesn't share a child together, that there's huge danger and increasing risk around threat of a gun. And we know how many homicides are committed with a firearm in a domestic violence situation. And we had an agreement actually with the Republican Party, because they were really holding it up, to say that boyfriend loophole could be closed if it was going forward. So not people who had been in the past been convicted, but anybody since the date of authorization who was convicted would not have access to the gun. And then that failed. And so there was pushback, and it was sort of last minute. So we would not have been able to get VAWA passed. It passed as part of the omnibus bill. I mean, there was also, one of the good things was an extension around the crimes that it's really a recognition of the tribal court sovereignty. So around sexual abuse and child abuse and some of the other sexual crimes committed on their lands, that they would have jurisdiction over those crimes. That was a huge win also. But the boyfriend loophole wasn't closed, and it wasn't closed in the Safer Communities Act, and it hasn't been closed. The only point that happened in VAWA was that ATF, so alcohol, they're the people responsible around firearms, the agency, they now have points of contacts in localities, so that if there is a situation and a domestic violence advocate wants to have a gun or needs to have a gun taken out of a certain situation, they have somebody to call who understands the issue and can deal with it on the federal level. And that was the big win in VAWA, but it's not enough. We're not satisfied, and we are going to be working on this for years to come.
Yeah. You mentioned the tribal jurisdiction, and I just want to draw out that we know Native American women suffer violence at the highest rate of prevalence in the country. Read in research this week that 90% of those offenses are committed by non-Native perpetrators. And so for the tribal courts to have jurisdiction to prosecute those, we know is really important, because it seems they just weren't getting prosecuted when they were turned over to other authorities. But concerning still to hear about that boyfriend loophole, meaning someone who has been a perpetrator, if they're, again, not in the marriage relationship, that they're going to be at liberty to still access guns. Is that right?
So the way it is now is that that if they're convicted of a misdemeanor, they will not have access to guns. But what we were also going, the loophole still exists around a protective order. And the pushback around this is that, like, you know, if I text you, like I'm abusing you, you know, like it was silly stuff around what does it mean to be in dating violence? What does it mean to be in a dating an abuser in that situation? And what we kept saying was, there's a conviction, there's a protective order. Those are serious. Those are serious things. A judge has said that this is a bad actor and has issued that protective order or or the conviction. And so what we're looking for is really to close that loophole so that even people with protective orders would not have access to those guns.
It's interesting how we're talking about loopholes in the federal law. At the same time, Francisco is looking at gaps and loopholes in the international framework and how important it is to work at all levels on addressing this seemingly intractable problem. I want to take a question from one of our attendees in the audience. And Indira, let me ask you, do you know of programs, national and local, for abusive partners, programs that you would recommend for abusers to participate in?
To be honest, I can't recall off the top of my head. I will say, just as a general note, I know there are programs, but what I will also say is that part of the kind of challenge around a lot of agencies serving perpetrators and those who commit the abuses is on the funding level, right? So meaning that if agencies get funding from the federal or local level, depending on kind of the requirements of that funding, it may not allow for that work with the abusers. But I know that there are definitely programs out there. I just don't have those names, so sorry about that.
Yeah. Marie?
Really, I'll expand a little bit on that. There is a national network of providers for doing work with abusive men. And that's been a change over the last 40 some years. But you're right, they're not adequately funded. And so I think the struggle is still there to provide those resources and specifically resources that really address the issues that batterers have within a theoretical context of holding them accountable and helping them to stop being abusive. But those resources are out there. They're just thin, I think.
And I think if I can also just say that there's a national conversation happening, particularly within the sexual violence movement, and advocates who not only work with advocates who not only work with survivors of sexual assault, but advocates who work with perpetrators who commit the violence. And the conversation is that the advocates who are working with the perpetrators are saying that we all need to come together and sit down at the same table to really partner to kind of, get to what we talked about earlier, the root causes and things like that. But that conversation is happening slowly, as you can imagine. But, those conversations are happening, and there is a lot of interest in being able to come together across the aisle, so to speak.
Could I add to that?
Go ahead.
So in VAWA, there's also some money, and it's a new grant for restorative justice. And so for people who don't want to choose who aren't interested in addressing the criminal system, and I think that there's restorative justice, and I feel, Indira, that that's kind of what you're talking about, like people coming together in community and talking about the harm that was done, being able to name it and speak it and have it listened, and for apologies to be made. And I think in a faith context, it's really interesting because a lot of faith work is around that kind of restorative justice. In Hebrew, we call it tshuva, repentance and repair, and there's steps to it. And I think that that's something that we should all be exploring more, and I feel hopeful around that.
Another audience question for Marie or Deborah or anyone else who wants to weigh in. How can we find scripture that can be used to address the claims that people make to try to justify abusive behaviors? This person is looking for maybe a comprehensive resource or resources that you could point them to on scriptural argument against abuse.
So go to Faith Trust Institute website or JWI website or a number of places at this point where you would find some bibliographical listing of resources. And again, I think we're back to the resource roadblock question of dealing with text and what text we have, and then what text we can look to that can give us some guidance as to what we should be doing. Just as an aside, I'm in a Bible study at my local church, and We just covered David and Bathsheba and Tamar in our Bible study, and the rape of Bathsheba and the rape of Tamar. And I was intrigued that there were women in our Bible study who'd never heard either of those stories. And yet they're pretty fundamental stories, but also very, very painful in terms of their description of how these women were exploited. And I think that's part of what we've got to do. We should be preaching these texts. We should be teaching these texts so that we have an understanding of what our traditions have said, and then looking at, well, what are the issues? What are the problems? And that in David and Bathsheba, finally someone steps forward and says, this is what you have done, David, and calls him out basically and calls him to account. Now, we need to hear that whole story and understand it as a story of rape and accountability. So the resources are there, and the academic work at this point is definitely moving forward to help bring us those resources. I would cite briefly Dr. Will Gaffney's work in terms of womanist interpretation of scripture as an excellent resource, and some of my books and so forth. That's what I've tried to raise up in looking at those issues. So it's out there, and I encourage folks to look for those.
So Faith Trust Institute, Jewish Women International are two websites you can go to learn about resources. Don't forget, we've put information in the chat in terms of hotlines if you or someone you know is seeking immediate help. And as we near the close of our time together, I want to give all of our speakers a chance to address the question of what other reforms or other types of actions do you think communities, in particular communities of faith, can take in order to be part of addressing this problem? Francisco, let me come to you first with this closing question.
Sure, thank you, Allison. So just to be very brief, looking at the time, if you're interested in supporting the international movement, go to everywoman.org, everywoman.org. That will, and support the work that we do to have a new binding global treaty that addresses violence against women for women in the whole world. If you want to get involved locally or bringing international human rights law locally, go to Cities for CEDAW, right? So even though the US hasn't ratified this international treaty, that doesn't mean that local governments like cities or counties can't incorporate those principles locally. That's what we're doing here in Santa Clara. We support different jurisdictions in doing that. Several jurisdictions throughout the US have incorporated these international women's rights principles in local law. So get in touch with Cities for CEDAW, or get in touch with me, and we can support you with our law students to have your local government officials pass laws that adopt international human rights law locally.
I like the sound of that. Indira, what would you invite people to do in terms of taking action or being part of the movement against violence?
Yeah, absolutely. I think particularly with communities of faith, as it relates to communities of color, that there really has to be an acknowledgement by the faith community around what sexual violence, domestic violence is, how it shows up, particularly in communities of color. And that's important and that's important because the way that some groups respond to gender-based violence is rooted in culture, is rooted in community. And so I think, particularly, for example, in the African-American community, as it relates to the faith community, it's hard. It's been very hard to get rape and domestic violence mentioned from the pulpit. And so I think when you begin to talk about it, when you begin to name it, when you begin to have those conversations, it begins to lift the veil, it begins to take away the shame, and it also lets folks know that we can talk about these things within this faith community. And so I think that's so critical because so many people who have gone to their faith-based leaders have not gotten the response and or the support that they've needed. And so some have fallen out of love with religion, as I like to say. And so I do think there's a role for educating the faith community on it, as well as the faith community kind of getting training around it for those communities who are not trained. So yeah.
And knowing where to go for experts like yourself when pastors need to refer. I learned this from Marie, when pastors need to refer to people who have the type of expertise you do.
Right. And I do think I think faith communities partnering with subject matter experts are so critical, particularly for having policies in the church as it relates to, gender-based violence in general, and just how folks engage with kids, and all of those things is so critical. The church is not exempt from that, and so what we have also found is that a lot of churches don't have those in place, and so that's critical as well too.
Deborah, can you share a call to action for faith communities in particular?
Well, the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence is coming up. It's in November. It's the theme this year is activism to end violence against women and girls. It's a global movement, and there's so many ways to get involved in that. And a lot of it is public awareness, a lot of social media. But I think it's worth getting involved in. And I think that faith communities need to show up, need to be part of the conversation. We are part of the solution and need to be active in these spaces. We convene the Interfaith Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence, which really works on federal legislation. But for Domestic Violence Awareness Month, every October, what we try to do is have people of faith hold up, and many faiths are in the room, hold up a sign with a text and said, my faith does not condone violence against women, and using a text, I'm saying that, and it's powerful. When people see those images, they connect that there must be violence in that community, or they wouldn't be doing this. And it doesn't condone it. And let me learn more about that. So I think that as people of faith, we just need to be in all these spaces.
And when you say a text, I take it you mean a text of scripture?
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes.
Not a text message, but a scriptural text.
Right.
Yeah. Just to clarify, but important, so important, 16 days of activism coming up. And finally, Marie, what are your calls to action? What would you encourage people of faith to do on this issue?
Well, actually, what I want to say at this point, Ellie, is I want to go back to your question about where is there hope for all of us. I think the reality that we're dealing with is very overwhelming for all of us. But I think that theologically, that we need to find our sources of hope, and to affirm that God did not create us to be victims and victimizers, that is not God's intention in any of our faith contexts. And someone asked at one point, is there any place that sexual violence and domestic violence are not endemic? I found one reference to an anthropological study that was done a number of years ago in West Africa, and I believe it was with the Ashanti people. And one of the things that the anthropologists found when they went there and they described rape, and the people were like, what? Why would anyone do that? Well, they had no idea. It was like they were from Mars and no idea what this was about or why. And so what the anthropological study found is that it was a culture in which men and women were equal and shared work equally, and their notion of the deity was both male and female, and their religious leaders were both male and female. So I think there's some real lessons there in terms of what kind of a culture are we looking at it, and do we want to move towards, that we can someday say, we don't do this. This just isn't done. And if it happens, it's peculiar, which it will, but it's peculiar. It's not normative. And I think that's where the efforts of all of us here today and many more people are trying to take this. And I give thanks for that.
I give thanks as well. Let's make sexual and domestic violence a rare aberration and dismantle it from its status as the leading human rights abuse. This is not what God intended for us. I think that's a wonderfully hopeful note for us to wrap up on. You did mention equality, Marie. So I do want to say the Equal Rights Amendment is one significant structural reform that Justice Revival and interfaith partners are working to secure, and it also would be an important part of a legal framework that addresses sexual and domestic violence more rigorously. So follow us at Justice Revival to hear more about the ERA and to hear more about this issue. This was such a rich conversation. I hope next year, instead of one event, we're doing a whole conference on this issue, because there is a lot that we can and need to explore. But our time is up for today. So I want to thank you all again for joining us. I want to let you know this event will be available on Justice Revival's website and Facebook page for you to rewatch and share. The chat box has hotline information in case you or someone you know is facing sexual or domestic violence right now. And finally, I want to warmly thank each of our excellent expert guests for being with us today. Dr. Indira M. Hennard of the DC Rape Crisis Center, Professor Francisco Rivera Juaristi of Santa Clara University School of Law, the Reverend Dr. Marie Fortune, founder of Faith Trust Institute, and Ms. Deborah Rosenblum of Jewish Women International. Thank you all so much. And that concludes our formal program.